Hello everyone, welcome to the Co-Ownership webinar series. I'm Gavin Gibson, your host and founder of Sirkin, the co-ownership social network that will connect you with a passionate community of like-minded folks looking to share the purchase of a residential or investment property. So if you're looking to get started with co-ownership, check out sirkin.com. Our guest is Andy Sirkin, a co-ownership pioneer and thought leader. In today's webinar, Andy's going to talk about the 3 key things you need to know if you're considering co-ownership. The topics that Andy will cover are types of co-ownership, an overview of the different arrangements available for sharing the purchase of real estate, common problems with co-ownership and how to avoid them, and finally, what types of financing are available for co-ownership. We'll wrap things up with a 10-minute Q&A at the end. Now, the duration for the webinar is expected to be 40 minutes. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Andy.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Sirkin. I'm very happy to be with you today. I graduated from law school in 1984 in Boston. Initially, I went to work for a big law firm in San Francisco, and I stayed there for several years. One of the things that happened while I was there was that I was relatively newly married, and my wife and I really wanted to buy our first home together. And this was a long time ago. This was in the early 80s, and housing was laughably inexpensive by today's standards at that time, but it seemed to us then that it was still out of reach. And so what we did was we put a group of our friends together and we bought an apartment building and we all moved in. And that was how I first became exposed to co-ownership. And after that was successful, several of my other friends and coworkers saw what we had done and became excited about it and asked me to help them do it for themselves. And that's how I first got involved in co-ownership. And that went on to lead to me giving talks to the general public, to real estate associations, to companies, universities about this. I started writing a lot. I got some radio and television interviews, and that sort of led to my ultimate career of being a co-ownership lawyer and facilitator, which is what I've been doing since roughly 1985. Since that time, I've organized over 10,000 co-ownership groups. The snowball, if you will, of the movement toward co-ownership has only increased. The diversity and types of co-ownership has only increased over that time. So let me just break down now sort of the different types, common types of co-ownership groups that I work with. So the most common type is what we call a space assignment co-ownership arrangement. That is where each person is permanently assigned a particular area of the property for their exclusive use. So for example, if it was an apartment building, each owner might be assigned a particular apartment for their exclusive use, along with a parking space perhaps and a deck and so forth. If it was a house, each person might be assigned a particular bedroom for their exclusive use. If it was a lot with multiple houses on it, each person might be assigned a particular portion of the lot or a particular house. So that's the way a space assignment TIC works. Another type of TIC or co-ownership arrangement that is very common in our practice is what we call a time assignment arrangement. That's where the owners share the usage of whatever they own according to time. So one owner will get to use it at one particular time, not necessarily the same time every year, but it could be. Another owner would get to use it at another time, and that arrangement would recur year after year after year. So each owner would have usage of the property during a particular time. Another type of co-ownership we work with a lot is what we call equity sharing. And that's an arrangement between both users and investors, where an investor provides, or a group of investors provides funds, let's say for a down payment or for another portion of the acquisition cost, and the occupant or occupants live in the property. And over time, they share in the benefits of ownership, such as the appreciation of the property. Then we also do quite a few special interest co-ownership arrangements. These are co-ownerships often called intentional communities, where the group shares a specific religion or ideology or desire to live together in a particular way. Typically, they have their own spaces as well as communal spaces where they can have shared meals, shared activities, give lectures, that type of thing. And then probably the last group is just a pure investment arrangement where the people are primarily coming together to purchase something to make a profit from. And these sometimes are organized in a traditional way where a sponsor finds the property and then tries to put the group together. And nowadays also by crowdfunding, where there's a web-based structure that promotes the investment, gathers people together, gives them a forum for communicating and developing their ideas, and then ultimately purchasing the property and then operating it online. So those are the types of co-ownership groups that we see most commonly in our practice. But of course, in reality, it could be anything that works for the owners.
Thanks for the overview of the arrangement types, Andy. Co-ownership offers a really flexible framework for sharing the purchase of a residential or investment property. Now, in your years of experience as a real estate lawyer who specialized in co-ownership, what common misconceptions and problems have you come across, and how do you avoid them?
Common misconception people have about co-ownership is that it typically doesn't work out or it's fraught with problems. And in my experience, the reason people have this impression is because many people have heard horror stories from friends or relatives or acquaintances about co-ownership arrangements that have gone bad or created lots of problems for them or been nightmares in one way or another. So you might wonder, well, if everyone's hearing horror stories, doesn't that mean that in fact co-ownership is problematic fundamentally? And my response is no, it doesn't mean that at all. And the reason is that the vast majority of co-ownership groups have no structure. They have no agreement, no arrangement in place. You might wonder why. If people on the one hand believe that co-ownership is fraught with risk, why wouldn't they think it was important to have an agreement? And I think the reason is that for many people, they assume that the co-owners with whom they are going to be buying or owning are not risky partners because they're their family members, they're their sisters and brothers, they're their relatives, they're their close friends who they've known since college and so forth. And so they assume that because they have this long-standing and close relationship that they don't need an agreement. But actually the opposite is true. The closer the relationship among the co-owners, the more they need to have an agreement because the stakes are so much higher. They're not just economic, but they're also personal. If something goes wrong or they have a disagreement, it becomes much more difficult politically for them to resolve their problems. But notwithstanding that fact, as I say, the majority of people who do co-ownership because of their relationship with the other co-owners feel they don't need an agreement, and so they don't have one. Of the people that do understand the importance of having an agreement, they often downplay it. So they'll have an agreement, but it will be something they just threw together because they wanted to, for example, keep it simple. Or they had an attorney prepare it who has no particular experience in co-ownership. So you've got the majority of people doing co-ownership with no agreement. Of those that have an agreement, the majority of those are doing it with a bad agreement or an overly simplistic agreement. And you only have a very small minority of people doing co-ownership with an actual well-prepared agreement done by somebody who was qualified. The good news is that among that relatively small minority who have a quality agreement, the incidence of problems among those people is well under 1% in our experience. That means 99+% of all of the co-ownerships with good agreements never have a problem. One of the things that's really important to understand about the role that the agreement plays is that it's essentially designed to be a fallback. In other words, we want to assume that the vast majority of people who do co-ownership are probably going to get along fine and be able to work things out without resorting to looking at their agreement. The agreement is there only for those rare occasions where there is a disagreement among the owners. And in those occasions, we want them to have the agreement to fall back on. And this is fundamental to understand when you are thinking about how an agreement should be designed. So, for example, a common misconception about agreements is that the simpler they are, the better. Well, the problem with simple and short when it comes to agreements is that it doesn't tend to perform the function for which you want the agreement. Namely, if and when, in the unlikely event you have a problem, you want to look to the agreement for a solution. Well, if the agreement is very short and very simple, the odds are that the solution won't be there because it's so short and simple. The particular problem that you're having will not be covered. And so the agreement isn't performing that essential function. So this is a situation where short and simple is not actually better, because if you have a normal situation that is exactly what you expect, you probably won't need to look at the agreement. It's only when you have those unexpected unexpected difficulties that you'll want to look to the agreement. And the agreement needs to be thorough enough and prepared by someone with enough experience with co-ownership so that it has the solutions for those unexpected problems that you didn't think of when you were first getting together.
Thanks, Andy. So most or all of the problems that you've seen with co-ownership arrangements have to do with the lack of an agreement or an overly simple one. So what types of things does an agreement have to capture in order to avoid problems down the road?
What are the important issues that one wants to cover in a co-ownership agreement? Well, the first one, and the most important one, I think, is usage rights. So obviously, in certain kinds of co-ownership, like pure investment co-ownership, there are no owner usage rights. So that's all we need to say, is that owners don't have the right to use the property. But when there are usage rights, whether they're space-based or time-based or something else, then we need to be very careful in the agreement to define exactly what those usage rights are, because the last thing that we want is to have a co-owner group where people think they have usage rights, but they don't know exactly what the extent of those usage rights are. What parts of the property can they use, for example, in a space assignment co-ownership, and what parts are shared? In a time-based co-ownership, when can they come? The extent to which they can send unaccompanied guests, family members, and so on to the property. So usage rights, or the lack of usage rights in the case of an investor, need to be carefully defined in these agreements. A corollary or related issue to usage rights are the restrictions or limitations of those rights. So when an owner has the right to use a particular area or the entire property, what can they do there? Can they make alterations? Can they have pets? Can they make noise? And so on and so forth. We need to know, we want the owners to know what they can do and what they can't do when they're exercising their usage rights in the property. And particularly if you've got people living together, for example, in an apartment building where each person has their own unit, or in a home where each person has their own bedroom but shares the dining room, the living room, and so on. When people are there together, it becomes especially important to spell out the limitations of those usage rights and the sort of cohabitation rules, things that people have to do to make living together acceptable and pleasurable. So usage rights and the restrictions on usage rights, the first issue. The next important area has to do with the expenses or costs of owning the property. So there's going to be ongoing costs in terms of recurring things like utility costs, insurance, property taxes, perhaps mortgage payments if there's a shared mortgage. And then there's going to be more episodic, let's say, costs like replacing the roof, painting the building, things like that. So we need to deal with both of those things in the sense that we need to know how we're going to be able to collect the money that's needed for those things when they're needed, who is going to be responsible for paying what percentage of those things, and so on. So the key to making this kind of cost allocation and collection system work is to have a budget. And based on that budget, to have owner assessments. So what's a budget? Well, a budget is where the owners are projecting out all their expenses, both long-term and short-term, their needs, if you will, and then based on that budget, setting out a system of contributions that the owners have to make periodically, perhaps every month, perhaps every 6 months, and perhaps every year, whatever, periodic assessments so that everyone knows what they are supposed to pay to make the budget work and when they're supposed to pay it. So all of that needs to be clarified so people know exactly what responsibilities they're getting into. They can make sure they can afford those payments when they're due. And also that sets up the enforcement of the agreement, because if owners if it's not clearly stated when owners are supposed to make a contribution, then if an owner fails to make the contribution, we don't know the extent to which that owner has violated the agreement. So just to give you an example, if the agreement is silent on, let's say, the collection of the money for the insurance bill comes, what happens? Somebody has to run around to all the owners and say, okay, the insurance bill is here, you need to pay your share. And then the other owner says, well, I don't have the money, or I didn't get your message, or my dog ate the bill, or whatever. And then enforcing that obligation just becomes that much more difficult. Compared with if you had a budget and an assessment system, everyone knows exactly when a payment is due, the amount of the payment, we know when it's late, and we know the consequences of that lateness. So budgeting and assessments. Now, a companion issue with budgeting and assessments is the issue of management. So we need to have the basic responsibilities, whether it's a responsibility to collect money, to pay bills, to get things fixed. We need to know who it is within the group that's going to be responsible to fulfill that duty at any particular time. Why? Why not just leave that open? We'll just figure it out as we go along. Well, the problem with figuring things out as you go along is that those things, or at least some of them, tend to fall between the cracks and not get done, or get done late, which makes them perhaps more expensive. So that's one consequence. Another possible consequence is that one member of the group who tends perhaps to be more conscientious than the others, or more obsessed, however you want to describe it, that person ends up doing everything, and over time gets resentful because they're doing so much, and that work is not getting reciprocated by the other owners. So to avoid those problems, we need to identify the particular things that need to get done within the group, and then describe in our agreement who is responsible for getting those done. So that can be an outside person that gets paid. It can be someone inside the group that gets paid. It can be a job or jobs that rotate around the group. It doesn't really matter so much how you do it, because there's lots of choices there. More, it matters that you do it, that there is some kind of system in place to make sure that the basic responsibilities get fulfilled, and that they aren't sort of left to the most conscientious person or fall through the cracks altogether. So that's budgeting, assessments, and management. What else is important? Another key issue is what we call exit strategy. So when we think about exit strategy, we really are thinking about two different concepts together. One is individual exit. That's where a particular owner needs to move on for one reason or another, needs to get out of the group. And we are also thinking about group exit. Group exit is where the whole property is sold and the proceeds for the sale are divided up among the owners. So what we want to know here in the exit strategy part of our agreement, for example, on individual exit, can an owner get out? How can they get out? Do they have to offer the other owners the right to purchase their interest? To what extent can they bring in an outside person? And do the other owners, the owners who aren't getting out, have the right to say something about whether that outside person is an acceptable partner or not? So how exactly is the individual exit going to work? On the group exit side, under what circumstances would the whole property be sold? Is it only when all the owners agree to sell it, or will it be sold at a particular time automatically unless everyone wants to keep it? Or is it a vote of a certain number of owners? And the group exit rules can be different over time. So for example, you could say for the first 5 years, it would have to be unanimous. And then for years 5 through 10, it would be majority or whatever. But again, the important thing is to say what will happen when somebody wants to get out, and what will happen if somebody can't get out individually, and so their only exit is through a sale of the entire property or a buyout by another owner. So saying those things is important. Why is it so important? Because a really bad thing for a group is to have someone in the group who really wants to get out but can't. And let's face it, in the real world, things don't, or you might even say most of the time, things don't work out exactly as everyone expects. So maybe everyone is saying, yeah, we're going to co-own this property for at least the next 30 years. We're sure nobody's ever going to want to get out. Well, that's great, and maybe it will work out that way. But more often what happens is there are changes. People lose their job, people get sick, people need to move, people's lifestyle changes, and so the property no longer suits their needs for one reason or another. And then they need to get out at an unexpected time. And we need to expect the unexpected in this case when we're creating the agreement. And that's the reason for having exit strategies spelled out rather than waiting until somebody needs to get out and then trying to figure out what to do. So exit strategies. The last important area that needs to be in these agreements is what we do when an owner doesn't perform as required by the agreement. So maybe they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. They're not doing something they are supposed to be doing, like making a payment, for example, or performing a responsibility. What happens in that situation? And when we think about default, one of the things we want to think about is that the consequence for default needs to fit within the larger context of the agreement, particularly with regard to usage. So in other words, if somebody has the right to, let's say, use a particular apartment or a particular house or a particular bedroom exclusively, when we first sort of developed the co-ownership, we were thinking, okay, what is that right worth, right? For example, if you have a nicer apartment in the building, one that's bigger or higher up or has better light or better amenities for one reason or another, generally speaking, if the co-ownership is well structured, that person has paid into the group in proportion to the relative value of their usage rights. So if they have a better unit, they've paid more. If they have a worse unit, they've paid less, both initially in terms of their purchase price and then on an ongoing basis in terms of their contributions to the ongoing expenses of the co-ownership. Well, what that means in terms of default is that if we see a person who is no longer performing, let's say they're no longer paying, we need to have a remedy that also diminishes their usage rights, right? So in other words, we can't, for example, we can't say, okay, we're going to take away 3% of your ownership, but you're going to get to keep that really nice unit. Well, that's not fair, right? Because now that person isn't paying in commensurate with their usage rights. And that's why, generally speaking, in a usage-based situation, a usage-based co-ownership, the ultimate sanction for default is typically what we call a foreclosure or forced sale. That's where that owner's interest is going to be sold on the open market, and that owner is going to be replaced by a new owner, because anything less than that is likely to yield a result that's inequitable in terms of that owner's usage rights. So just to quickly sum up those main points for these agreements, we have usage rights or lack of them. We have the limitations or restrictions on those usage rights. We have the issue of budgeting and assessments. How are we going to collect the money? Who's supposed to pay what, when? We have the issue of management. Who's going to fulfill those basic responsibilities of owning the property? We have exit strategies, both individual exit and group exit. And then finally, default. What happens if somebody does something they're not supposed to do or doesn't do something that they are supposed to do?
I can see why it's so important to partner with a real estate lawyer who's experienced with co-ownership. And this brings me to my final question. What types of financing have you seen for co-ownership arrangements, and what type of mortgage products are typically available for those?
So the type of financing that people get tends to be different for different types of co-ownership. So for example, in a space assignment type of co-ownership where people are assigned a particular unit or house or part of a property, those types of arrangements typically do have financing. In other words, people are not paying all cash. That compares, for example, with a time-based co-ownership where, for the most part, people do not have mortgages. So those are second homes that people are sharing without mortgages. So in the space-based space, if you will, the old model for many, many years, and still the model for shared use of homes, one home where people have their own bedrooms, that tends to be the group mortgage, which is one mortgage that the entire group shares. Why? Because so far that's been the only product that's been available in the marketplace anywhere in the US, as far as I know. So to the extent that people are sharing a house with individual rights to bedrooms and shared use of common spaces, they tend to get one mortgage. And then the mortgage payments are part of the monthly dues system. So each person is paying their dues, and that includes their contribution to the mortgage, among other things. For the type of space-based co-ownership where people are assigned an entire house or an entire apartment unit, in those types of arrangements, we have had fractional financing available depending on when you're doing it and where you are. So the current picture on fractional financing is that it's available in both Northern and Southern California, and to a limited extent in some other major cities. We've seen these, for example, in Seattle, Washington. We've seen them in Boston. We've seen them in New York City, all with fractional mortgages. So you might ask, well, what is he talking about? What are fractional mortgages? So fractional mortgages are mortgages where each owner who wants a mortgage has his or her own loan. So it's not a shared loan. They make their payments directly to the lender, and the lender has the right to foreclose on that particular owner's percentage share of the property and all of their occupancy rights if that owner defaults. That's different than in a group situation where if for whatever reason the group mortgage is not paid, then the entire property is at risk. So fractional mortgages are highly desirable, much less risky, but unfortunately are only available for certain specific types of co-ownership in certain specific places.
Thanks, Andy. So there are different financing options based on location and type of property. Can you tell us a little bit more about group and fractional mortgages?
So let me start the answer by sort of defining some of these terms. So when we talk about a group mortgage, what we mean is one loan secured by the entire property that everyone shares the payments on. And one of the central characteristics of this type of group financing is that if there ever is a default, then what it means is that everyone's equity is at risk because the bank could theoretically take the entire property. So this is not the most ideal setup, but in many cases, especially years ago, this was the only type of financing available. So if you wanted financing, you had to do this group mortgage. And there are various strategies that co-ownership groups take to try to minimize the risk of the group mortgage. For example, making sure that the monthly payments are scheduled as part of the budget, that each person is making their payment to the group every month that includes the mortgage payment, and that the group is making the payment to the bank so that everyone knows that the payments are coming in from the owners and getting made to the bank. And also to ensure that if there is a non-payment, we have a reserve system in place so that the group has put aside money to cover the payments in the event that one owner or more than one owner is not making their payment. So that's the basic structure for a group mortgage. Now, you also mentioned in the question the idea of fractional mortgage. So what's a fractional mortgage? In a fractional mortgage situation, each individual member of the group has a separate loan. And that means that they make their payments directly to the bank. And if they fail to make a payment, the bank has the right to foreclose just on that one owner's share of the property, meaning their percentage interest in the property along with all of their usage rights. So the lender is foreclosing and then generally reselling that interest. So in order to make fractional loans, a lender's got to be confident that if they do have a defaulting borrower, they're going to be able to take that share back through foreclosure and readily resell it on the marketplace. If the lender doesn't think that's going to be possible or doesn't have confidence in the marketplace being able to respond to that type of foreclosure, then the lender is going to say, no, I'm not going to make fractional loans in this situation. They're too risky. So with that context, what can we say about what types of financing are available, where they're available, and for what types of co-ownership? So generally speaking, the only option for most co-ownership groups still today is going to be the group mortgage. The exception being co-ownership arrangements where people are assigned an entire house or an entire apartment unit in a multi-unit building as their exclusive domain, if you will. And that co-ownership is either located in California, both Northern and Southern California, or in a major city like Seattle, Boston, or New York. Those are places where lenders have said, okay, we feel we can make fractional loans because we can see that the marketplace is robust enough to absorb a foreclosure-based resale. So if you are doing that type of fractional ownership, of co-ownership in those particular locations, then you're going to be able to get fractional financing. Otherwise, if you need financing at all, it's probably going to be one loan that's shared by the entire group.